My name is Angelo and I am 16 years old. About 3 months ago, my parents left me alone because they had to attend a wedding. I live with my family and my 2 dogs, Rex and Luna. Rex and Luna are both pit bulls, so I had nothing to fear if someone tried to break into the house. A few hours after my parents left, I let Rex and Luna outside to do their business. I suddenly heard barking and went to check on them. That's when I saw a woman standing on the other side of the fence staring at my dogs. She was about 5'5", in her late 30s. "You have such beautiful dogs. Can I pet them?" she asked. I was standing about 3 feet from the fence, but I could already smell the strong scent of cigarettes coming from her clothes. "Sorry, they don't really like being petted, but thanks for the compliment," I said quickly, trying to get my dogs back inside. As I led them in, she gave me a stare that still haunts me to this day. Once inside, I made sure all the doors were locked and checked to see if she had left. When I could no longer see her, I hurried to take my dogs to a room farthest from the back door. I texted my mom, letting her know that a strange woman had been outside trying to pet the dogs. Now, I should mention that there are apartments near our neighborhood, and we've had a few people stop and admire our dogs before. But something about this woman made both me and my dogs feel extremely uneasy. My mom texted back saying they wouldn't be home anytime soon, but told me to stay safe. A few minutes later, I heard the doorbell ring, and all the dogs went crazy. My bedroom is quite large, but they were running around wildly. I decided not to check who was at the door and just stayed with my dogs. We were watching a movie when suddenly I heard a clicking sound at the window. I immediately paused the movie, my heart racing. I started panicking inside, wondering if it was the same woman trying to break in. Then I heard a loud crash. Summoning all my courage, I peeked out the window. What I saw sent shivers down my spine. The same woman was breaking into my neighbor's house. I quickly closed the curtains and called 911. I stayed silent, not wanting to alert her to my presence. The dispatcher assured me that the police would arrive in about 2 minutes. Then I heard screaming coming from my neighbor's house. Looking out the window again, I saw my neighbor fighting off the woman while she shrieked uncontrollably. I was still on the phone with the dispatcher, informing them that my neighbor was now attacking the woman in self-defense. By then, the police had arrived. They had to use a taser on the woman because she was violently resisting. She was cursing in a way that would make a sailor blush, thrashing uncontrollably. The officers found a knife on her and also secured a gun nearby. Then, she started screaming that she was going to kill me and my dogs and burn my house down. I realized that she might have been high on something and had mistaken my neighbor's house for mine since they looked very similar. I sat there in shock, staring out my window, thinking about what would have happened to me and my dogs if she had broken into my house instead. I started crying and held on to my dogs tightly. I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there until I eventually fell asleep. The next thing I knew, I heard my parents unlocking the front door and calling out that they were home. I didn't know how to explain everything, but I eventually told them to speak with our neighbors. Days passed, and now my parents insist that I can't be home alone anymore. I can't get the image of her terrifying stare out of my head. Now, I sleep with both my pit bulls beside me just to feel safe. I know I'm safe now, but knowing what that woman was capable of still haunts me. If she had broken into my house instead of my neighbor's, I know for sure that my dogs and I would have died that night. Stay safe out there. "10 years ago, my mother-in-law, I'll call her M for anonymity, lived with my husband and me for a short period due to some health issues she was dealing with at the time. We thought it would be best for her to stay with us for a while. Let me tell you, M was not your typical mother-in-law. She had struggled with severe addiction for most of her life and had been in and out of prison throughout my husband's childhood. However, in her later years when her health declined, she had been clean for 8 years. Em was incredibly energetic when she was in one of her moods. She could stay awake for 4 to 5 days straight. During these episodes, she had an obsession with exploring abandoned houses, wandering through them and taking whatever she thought had value. One day I walked into my house and found a note on my kitchen table. Alongside it was what appeared to be a printed out image from Google Earth. The note was from Em, saying that she had been playing around on Google Earth, looking at areas near where we lived, and had discovered an abandoned house deep in the woods not far from our home. According to the printout, the house had no mailbox, no driveway, and no visible remnants of a path leading to it. The strangest part was that it was about a mile from the nearest road, with no dirt paths or trails leading to it. Something about it unsettled me, but curiosity got the better of me. I looked at Em and asked if she wanted to go check it out. Needless to say, she didn't hesitate for a second, and a few days later, on the following weekend, we set off to find the house. The road closest to the house was at the edge of a suburban neighborhood, so we parked there and started our trek, through thorns, poison oak, and everything in between. The hike was rough, but about a mile in we both looked up, and there it was. Right in the middle of this dense forest was a small clearing, less than half the size of a football field, with a tiny run-down house and a small stone well beside it. To say I was shocked would be an understatement. I glanced over at Em and she looked absolutely ecstatic. It didn't take her long to find a way inside, and she immediately started oohing and aahing over whatever she found. I, on the other hand, decided to stay outside. Something inside me just told me I did not need to go into that house. While standing outside, I wandered over to the old stone well to the left of the house. I approached the edge and peered down, but it was too dark to see much. I stepped back and sat down on one of the large rocks beside it. Out of boredom, I picked up a rock and dropped it into the well, listening for the splash as it hit the water below. As soon as I stood up and leaned in for a better look, the most horrific, gut-wrenching smell hit me like a ton of bricks. It was so overpowering that it burned my nostrils. Let me tell you, once you've smelled that scent, you never forget. I pulled my small flashlight from my pocket and shone it down into the well. The moment my light focused on what was below, I stumbled backward as if some invisible force had shoved me. I fell hard onto the ground. I will never forget what I saw at the bottom of that well. 2 elbows and the back of a head with long, dark hair. The smell was the unmistakable stench of human decomposition. I don't think I've ever run faster in my life. I just took off. I didn't even stop to tell Em I was leaving, I just ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I sat inside for about an hour, trying to process what I had just found, when it finally hit me that I had left Em behind. Eventually, she came back to the car carrying all the valuables she had collected. The moment she got in, she saw my pale face and the absolute shock in my expression. She asked what was wrong, and I told her exactly what I had seen. Her jaw dropped, and she turned as white as a ghost. Honestly, I had no idea what to do, so I drove to the nearest store and called the non-emergency 911 line. I explained what I had found and how I had stumbled upon it. Needless to say, the investigator on the phone seemed skeptical. I could tell. He thought Em and I were just a couple of troublemakers, but he still drove out to meet us at the end of the neighborhood. He explained that he would have to hike the mile into the woods to find the abandoned house and the well where the body was. Not even 20 minutes later, police cars and a coroner's vehicle arrived at the scene. They quickly began sealing off the entire wooded area while I just sat in my car, watching everything unfold. At one point, I saw 2 officers carrying a fully zipped-up black body bag and loading it into the back of the coroner's vehicle. I shuddered, thinking about who that person might have been and what could have happened to them. A few months later, I received a call from one of the detectives working on the case. She wanted to inform me that they had identified the body. The victim was a 24-year-old woman who had been reported missing from a small town called Riverton, Georgia, about 7 to 8 months prior. Riverton was an hour and a half away from where her body was found. There was no vehicle in the area. The craziest part? Many of the detectives who worked on the case had grown up in the very area where we found the body. Most of them were in their 50s, and not a single one of them had ever heard of or known about that abandoned house deep in the woods. My name is Daniel, and this was the most horrifying experience I've ever had. Something straight out of a horror movie. I live in a small rural town in California and work at a local Domino's. To get home, I have to walk through a forest. I've been working at Domino's since I was 17 and now I'm 19. I've walked through that forest countless times and nothing strange has ever happened to me until tonight. My shift ended at 7:30 p.m., a little later than usual. I stepped outside and started walking. In the distance, I could already see the forest. Eventually, I reached it and stood at the edge of the road for a moment to get my bearings. Imagine a narrow road with trees lining both sides. At this time of night, there were hardly any cars or people around. The darkness was settling in, and the limited light only made the atmosphere even more unsettling. As I walked, I thought I heard something coming from the trees. I stopped and looked around but saw nothing. I kept walking when out of nowhere a rock landed right in front of me. I froze. Turning toward the trees, I saw someone standing there waving at me. It was too dark to make out any details of their face or clothing. "Hey, do you need something?" I called out. The person responded in a loud whisper, "Hey, come here. I want to show you something." I hesitated. "I have to get home. I can't be late." "Oh, don't worry. It'll only take a second," they replied. "I really need your help with something." I sighed, debating whether I should just ignore them and keep walking. But against my better judgment, I agreed. "Fine, but I can only stay for a minute." "1 minute is all I need," they assured me. I took a deep breath and walked toward them. They told me they had found a strange man-made hole in the ground and wanted to see what was inside, but they didn't have a flashlight. I offered to shine my iPhone's light into the hole. That was the biggest mistake of my life. As I stepped closer, standing at the edge of the hole with the person behind me, I raised my phone to turn on the flashlight, and then they shoved me. I fell. I dropped about 20 feet, landing on something soft. Dazed, I groaned and immediately started cursing, yelling up at the person who had pushed me, but when I looked around, I couldn't see them anymore. I pushed myself up, trying to get my bearings, and realized that whatever I had landed on didn't feel like dirt or leaves. It was soft, fleshy. Dread washed over me. I needed to see what it was. I turned on my phone's flashlight, aimed it downward, and my entire world shattered. The light revealed a woman's body. She was completely naked, looking to be in her early 20s. She was dead. Her body was covered in deep cuts. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped in a pit with a corpse. I stayed down there for what felt like an eternity, probably half an hour, before I finally managed to claw my way out. As soon as I was free, I ran, home without looking back. I never told my parents what I saw. I only confided in a few of my closest friends. To this day, I don't know who that person was, and I don't want to know. I think I was around 19 or 20 when this happened. I was walking home after a night out with some friends, and for some reason, maybe because I was feeling good, or maybe just to take my time, I decided to take the long way home. The long way involved walking down this old avenue lined with some really beautiful massive houses. I'm pretty sure most of them were built in the early 1900s, and some of the intricate brickwork could make you feel like you'd stepped back in time, if it weren't for all the brand new Mercedes parked in the driveways. So, I was walking, a little slower than usual, just admiring the scenery weaving through the flower beds in the middle of the road. Like I said, it was a gorgeous area. So nice, in fact, that a punk kid like me, wearing scuffed-up skate shoes, a beanie, and a black hoodie, looked completely out of place. And that's why, even though I couldn't believe what happened next, I could kind of understand it. As I walked, I looked up at the detailed carvings on the stone facades near the rooftops. Some had dates etched into them, others had elaborate designs. That's when I suddenly heard a voice. Hey, what are you looking at?" I snapped my gaze downward and saw a guy sitting on the front steps of what I assumed was his house. I wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't causing trouble, so I answered a little defensively, "Nothing, man. What's it to you?" His reaction was to stand up and start walking toward me, and only then did I realize just how unsettling this guy was. He was big. Instinctively, I started stepping back, holding my hands up like, "Whoa, chill out, man." But he kept coming, right up in my face, growling these demands that I'd tell him what I'd been looking at. I just gestured toward the house and said, "Your place, man. What do you want?" And for some reason, some cruel trick of fate, what I thought was a totally harmless answer sent him into a rage. Now, I don't care how big or intimidating someone is, I don't have time for that kind of drama. So I just kept backing up until I was at a safe enough distance, then turned and started walking away. But as I did, I heard a terrible sound, the unmistakable metallic click that froze me in place. "Turn around," the guy ordered, and my worst fear came true. He had a gun pointed straight at me. I had never been more terrified in my entire life. I was shaking so hard I couldn't even hide it. He started ranting, going off about how his house had been broken into, how the cops wouldn't do anything, how guys like him had to take matters into their own hands. I got it. I really got it. When I was 12, some kid from my neighborhood stole my bike. I watched him ride it around for weeks before he finally wrecked it and dumped it in the river. I knew the kind of frustration that makes you want justice, but the problem was, this guy was about to take it out on me instead of an actual criminal. Luckily, he cooled down, just enough. After making me promise never to walk through that neighborhood at night again, he finally lowered the gun and let me leave. People always talk about rough neighborhoods and how you shouldn't walk through them at night. But no one warns you about the nice neighborhoods, and let me tell you, they can be just as dangerous. It was the summer of 1974, and I was 16 years old at the time. I had just attended a concert in the city with my friends, Mark and Tom. The three of us were taking the train home. When we reached our stop, we got off and started walking along the main road, chatting excitedly about the concert, still buzzing from the incredible atmosphere. It was around midnight. As we crossed a major intersection, there weren't many cars on the road at this hour. Suddenly, we noticed an old brown station wagon stop in the middle of the intersection, not far from us. The window rolled down, and inside sat a man, probably around 25 to 30 years old. Though he looked a little suspicious, we assumed he was just going to ask for directions, so we stood there waiting to see what he wanted, completely unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Then, he pulled out a handgun from his lap. What he said next still sends chills down my spine to this day. In a calm voice, he asked, "Who wants it first?" We froze, paralyzed with shock and sheer terror. It took a few seconds for the gravity of the situation to sink in. Without even exchanging a glance, we all bolted across the intersection. The sound of our footsteps echoed against the pavement, and then gunshots rang out into the night. As we sprinted towards a cluster of bushes, my heart pounded in my chest. I was completely terrified, expecting a bullet to hit me or one of my friends at any moment. When we finally had the courage to look back, the car was gone. We let out shaky sighs of relief, standing there trying to catch our breath. Fortunately, we knew the area well, so we decided to take an old gravel path that would lead us home. As we walked, conversation was sparse. We were too shaken by what had just happened and how incredibly lucky we were. But that relief didn't last long. As we neared the end of the gravel path, I spotted a car parked at the end of the road. A terrible feeling crept over me. Could it be him? We kept walking, but then, like a scene from a horror movie, the car's headlights flashed on and the engine roared to life. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, my stomach dropped. It was the same brown station wagon. He had been waiting for us. He must have known these streets well, predicting where we would end up. We wasted no time. Once again, we ran for our lives, leaping over the fence of a nearby house. We didn't stop. We just kept running, jumping over fences one after another. Every time we glanced at the street, we saw his car speeding past, searching for us. Each time we reached an open road, he would appear again, accelerating toward us, forcing us to dive over another fence and find a new escape route. This terrifying game of cat and mouse continued 2 or 3 more times. Finally, around 1:30 a.m., we reached the end of a street. A tall fence blocked our way, covered in barbed wire. With no other choice, we climbed it. The sharp wire tore through our clothes and scraped my arm as I slid down, making me wince in pain. We found ourselves in what looked like a grazing field. We crouched down, hiding in the shadows, gasping for air. None of us cared that we were sitting in the dirt. We were just trying to disappear. For about 15 minutes, we stayed completely still, listening for any signs of the car, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, we convinced ourselves that he had given up and left. On our way back to the main road, we remained hyper-aware, constantly checking over our shoulders. Several times, distant headlights made us hold our breath, fearing that it was the brown station wagon again. But by 3:00 a.m., we saw it no more. We finally dropped off Tom at his house. Mark came back to mine for a little while so we could process what had just happened. He left later that night. What was supposed to be a 20-minute walk home had turned into something none of us would ever forget. What made it even more chilling was that about a week later, I saw a news report about an elderly woman who had been randomly shot late at night, not too far from where our encounter took place. Whether it was the same man, I'll never know. All I do know is that my friends and I were incredibly lucky to have escaped that night. I inherited a rundown piece of land in my early 30s when an uncle passed away. I know that sounds ungrateful, but if you had seen it, you would have laughed just like the rest of my family. They teased me with countless ghost stories because the property was located in the middle of nowhere, deep in the forest. I figured I might as well check it out for a weekend. No one wanted to come with me, and my mother, worried sick, made me promise to call her every night. I left on a Friday afternoon, planning to return on Saturday. Since I drove a truck, I decided I would just sleep in it, even though there was a cabin on the property. Unfortunately for me, I was warned that there was no running water. Still, I told myself I could fix the place up and sell it, even if I had to settle for a low price. As I drove up the private driveway on the 4-acre lot, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but I brushed it off and kept going. The trees were so dense that I felt like I was getting lost, but soon enough I spotted the cabin. It looked far too new compared to the otherwise decayed surroundings. A few abandoned cars sat nearby, along with a pile of rotting wood near a shed beside the cabin. The moment I stepped out of my truck, ice seemed to rush through my veins. Maybe it was just nerves, but I was certain I saw a shadow in the forest. I felt ridiculous, but I still called out, "Hello?" Of course, there was no response, and the shadow disappeared. I convinced myself it might have been a bear, so I hurried to the front door, fumbling with the keys until I finally got inside. There was no furniture except for an old table and a single chair. Clearly, my uncle had started cleaning up the place before his death. Thinking of him made me uneasy. Was his ghost haunting the cabin? I had no idea that the scariest thing wasn't inside but lurking just beyond the trees. I debated whether I should stay, but before I knew it, I was dragging my bag and mattress inside. Sitting at the table, I ate a simple meal and made mental notes on what needed to be done before selling the place. That's when I heard it. A metallic sound coming from not far behind the back door. I wasn't sure, but it sounded like a knife or an axe being sharpened. My imagination was running wild, but the sound felt real. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but when I looked out the back window, I saw nothing at first. Just as I turned back to the table, something caught my eye in the corner of my vision. I gasped as I turned around. Something was there. It was a large, dark figure staring at me from the edge of the forest. Too small to be a bear, but why would a person be out here in the middle of nowhere? I stepped closer to the window for a second look, but by then, it had vanished. I kicked myself for not bringing a weapon. I didn't even have a multi-tool, which was unlike me. I had been a tomboy my entire life, always carrying tools with me, but at that moment all I had was a flashlight. Deciding that bravery wasn't the best option, I stayed inside and started jotting notes in a journal. Then, I froze. The metallic sound came again. This time I was sure it was coming from inside the cabin. I stood up, my heart pounding, and crept around, calling out, "Who's there?" Believe me when I tell you that I nearly jumped out of my skin when a shadow moved past the window. The terrifying part was that I couldn't tell if the figure was inside the cabin or outside. Panicked, I rushed to the window. Once again, I saw a massive shape near the edge of the forest. Closer this time. I stood frozen, barely blinking, trying to make sure I wasn't imagining things. It felt like hours passed, but eventually I had to blink. The moment I did, the figure disappeared. I was convinced there was a deranged man watching me, and I knew I had to leave. But what if he was waiting for me outside? I gathered my belongings and ran for the front door. But just as I reached it, I heard something fall in the next room. Was he inside? I had no way of knowing, and I wasn't about to find out. I threw open the door and sprinted to my truck as fast as I could. Thank God the engine started immediately. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I swear, I could still see the figure standing there. But when I slowed down for one last look, it was gone. It might sound strange, but in the end, I gave the property to my father. He's never had any problems there. I live in a relatively safe area of Scotland, though I've had some truly strange and unsettling experiences since moving here about 4 years ago. I'm a petite 29-year-old woman, and I work at a pub, which means I often finish my shifts quite late. I never wear headphones when walking home at night, so that night was no different. I set my alarm, locked up, double-checked everything, said goodbye to my coworkers, and we all went our separate ways. I usually cut through the grocery store parking lot on my way home, and that night, something caught my attention. There were a few cars parked there, which was normal, but something felt off. I glanced over my shoulder and noticed a guy in a hat walking a short distance behind me. Nothing particularly strange about that, but I decided to keep an eye on him anyway. I left the parking lot and reached the main road where I live, though I still had about a mile to go before reaching my apartment. I looked over my shoulder again, and sure enough, the guy was heading in the same direction as me. The distance between us was slowly closing. Feeling uneasy, I decided to cross the road. Not only could I watch for traffic, but I could also keep an eye on him. After crossing, I didn't look back for a few minutes, assuming he'd stayed on the other side. But then I started hearing footsteps getting closer. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that he was only about 20 feet away. I had a glass bottle of soda in my bag, and though I thought I might be overreacting, I'd rather be safe than sorry. I slipped my hand into my bag and gripped the bottle tightly. Another 45 seconds passed, and the guy was close enough to reach out and touch me. Instead, he slowed his pace to match mine and then said, "Hey, how are you?" I ignored him and didn't respond. I had long since stopped pretending to be polite if I felt uncomfortable. I really didn't care about a stranger's feelings if they made me uneasy. But he kept talking. "Hey, did you work today?" I answered curtly. "No." "Are you heading home?" "Yeah." "You live this way?" I just looked at him, and he tried again. "Do you live at the end of this road? Whereabouts do you stay? Do you live nearby?" I didn't respond and instead slowed my pace to let him walk ahead. I still gripped the glass bottle, ready to use it if he tried anything. He attempted to slow down so I could catch up to him, but I had slowed down so much that I was barely moving. At this point, he was about 300 feet ahead of me. That's when he stopped, turned around, and just stood there, watching me, waiting for me to catch up. I reached into my other pocket, trying to grab my phone, only to realize it had died. I had thought the battery would last the whole way home, but apparently, this creep had other plans. Surprisingly, he started walking again, but still at a very slow pace. After another minute, he looked over his shoulder again. I saw an opportunity, a small path leading to an apartment complex hidden behind a tall fence. Without hesitation, I darted down the path, leaving him behind. I waited nearly 10 minutes, never once letting go of the glass bottle. Before continuing, I cautiously peeked around the fence, checked behind trash bins and the bus stop to make sure he wasn't lurking anywhere. As far as I could tell, I had lost him. Maybe he didn't have bad intentions. But if you suspect a woman is afraid of you while she's walking alone at night, don't talk to her. It won't help. And definitely don't keep asking where she lives. I wasn't drunk, I didn't look lost, and I didn't need any help. I was just walking home like I always do. Still, I strongly believe he had bad intentions. I'd rather be overly cautious than regret not being careful enough. That guy was definitely following me home that night. I am a single father to an incredible daughter who has been the light of my life since the day she was born. It would be an understatement to say that things haven't been easy since her mother passed away, but we've managed to navigate the grief together, and it has only strengthened our bond. As she grew older and eventually left the nest, we maintained a wonderful relationship. However, as she matured, I found myself increasingly haunted by the fear of losing her. Sometimes the fear of loneliness was just background noise, something I tried to drown out by keeping busy. But at other times it became overwhelming, and I became overly cautious and protective. There were moments when I felt like I had failed as a father. She missed out on school trips, friends' birthday parties, and countless playdates because I was too anxious to let her be in unfamiliar places without me. By the time she turned 13, I realized I had never left her home alone, not even for a quick grocery run. When she was younger, I would insist she stop whatever she was doing to accompany me on errands. But as she grew older, she became increasingly frustrated with my constant hovering. Things came to a head one day during a small argument. She insisted on staying home to finish her homework while I ran to the store. I won the argument, and she reluctantly came along, her face stormy the entire time. But that moment made me question whether I needed to loosen my grip as she grew older. A few months later, after much reflection, I decided to give her some space. I walked into her room and told her I was making a quick trip to Target. She groaned, slid off her chair, and started putting on her shoes. But this time I told her I was going alone. She smiled, a smile that brought me immense joy. It was a milestone for both of us. She was growing up, and it was time to give her some independence. I know it sounds silly, but I was genuinely emotional as I got into the car and pulled out of the driveway. Kids grow up too fast, and though it's a cliche, it's true. As I drove to Target, I tried to hold back tears, repeatedly telling myself everything would be fine. Surprisingly, I started to feel calmer. But as I wandered the aisles picking up a few things, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw it was my daughter calling. I assumed she wanted me to pick something up for her. I answered, but before I could say anything, all I heard were screams and sobs. I abandoned my cart, ran out of the store, and rushed back to my car. As I sped home, I tried to calm her down and asked what was happening. All she could say was, I don't know. I think someone shot something. My next question was whether she was hurt. And when she said yes, I threw the phone down, gripped the steering wheel, and accelerated. A few minutes later, I was just 2 blocks from our apartment when I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. My stomach churned as I realized I had 2 clear choices: flee the police and risk being shot to reach my daughter, or pull over and explain the situation, potentially condemning her to an unknown fate. For some, this might seem like a difficult decision, but for a parent, there's no choice at all. You help your child no matter what. I had never imagined I'd be involved in a police chase, but there I was, speeding away from the officers, praying they'd understand. I wiped out 2 blocks, skidded into our driveway, and jumped out of the car with my hands raised as the police closed in. They took cover behind their doors, guns and tasers pointed at me. I shouted, I'm so sorry, my daughter's in trouble. I couldn't stop. I kept repeating my story as one officer approached, his gun drawn. I don't know if it was my tone or the look in my eyes, but he stopped and asked for my keys. Realizing he was giving me the benefit of the doubt, I told him the front door key was on my car key, still in the ignition. He ordered his partner to keep an eye on me, took my keys, turned off the car, and ran into our apartment to find my daughter. Those were the most harrowing minutes of my life. I didn't know what the police would find, whether there was an intruder still inside or if they'd discover my daughter's lifeless body. Waiting for an answer with a gun trained on me felt like an eternity. When the officer emerged a few minutes later, leading my daughter out of the apartment, it was the most overwhelming relief I'd ever felt. But when I saw her covered in blood, I begged the police to call an ambulance. They assured me she'd be okay and that her injuries were superficial. Still, I was arrested for fleeing the traffic stop. I understood the officer was just doing his job, but sitting in the back of the patrol car while my daughter was treated was agonizing. After the police confirmed my daughter's injuries were minor, cuts from broken glass rather than gunshot wounds, I felt a second wave of relief. The paramedics arrived, checked her wounds, and took her to the hospital for stitches. Meanwhile, I was processed and released on bail a few hours later, with a court summons for fleeing the traffic stop. I immediately drove to the hospital to pick her up. She had a stitch along the worst cut on her jawline, and as we drove home I asked her to explain exactly what had happened. She told me she'd been making a sandwich and had just set a glass of water on the kitchen counter when it suddenly exploded. The glass shards caused the cuts on her arm and face. She also mentioned hearing a loud bang from the neighboring apartment. After speaking with the police who were still at the scene, it became clear what had happened. The bullet hole in our kitchen wall indicated the shot had come from next door. The neighbor, apparently drunk or otherwise impaired, had decided to clean his gun without checking if it was loaded. He'd fired accidentally, shattering the glass and causing my daughter's injuries. The neighbor was arrested and charged with reckless endangerment. He eventually received probation, mandatory, substance abuse counseling, and had his firearms confiscated. While I felt he deserved harsher punishment, I was just grateful my daughter wasn't more seriously hurt. As for my charges, the judge took the circumstances into account. Instead of a year-long license suspension, I was fined $500, a deal my lawyer called the best possible outcome. The incident made it clear to both my daughter and me how close we'd come to disaster, and I was deeply grateful we'd avoided tragedy. But just as I began to feel comfortable giving her more space, my anxiety about losing her returned stronger than ever. It began to take a toll on my mental health, and for the first time in my life, I sought therapy at my sister's recommendation. The weekly sessions significantly reduced my paranoia and overprotectiveness, though I never became one of those laid-back, hands-off parents. Even after she moved out and into a luxurious downtown apartment, I remained her father. Nothing in this world would change that, but it also meant I would always carry the fear of losing her until the day I died. Therapy helped me find a balance between protecting her and allowing her to live her life. I learned to trust her judgment and give her the independence she needed. Still, I'll always be the dad who worries, who double-checks, and who's ready to drop everything at a moment's notice. That's just who I am, and I've come to accept it. My daughter may be grown, but she'll always be my little girl, and I'll always be there for her no matter what. Back when I was a student, I worked as a bartender at a nightclub in Liverpool. Most places closed around 2 a.m., but we stayed open until about 6 a.m., cleaning up the stragglers who spilled out from trendier spots. This meant we spent every night clearing out all sorts from the bar, and you could categorize the usual drunks into 4 types. The first type were the happy drunks, sometimes annoying but generally good-natured. The second were the sad drunks, often a nuisance but rarely aggressive. Then there were the sleepy drunks, those who had to be woken up from their cozy corners at the end of the night. And lastly, the rare and unsettling blackout drunks, completely unpredictable and best removed from the premises as soon as possible. When I say blackout drunk, I don't just mean people who drink too much and pass out. No, real blackouts are a medical phenomenon. I'm not an expert, but from what I understand, some people have a particular reaction to alcohol, not always, but occasionally, where their brain essentially shuts off, and they lose all inhibition and social awareness. It's like no one is at the wheel. You can imagine how dangerous that is, which is why I always made sure they were escorted out quickly. One quiet night, people had come and gone in a slow trickle when a guy walked in. He was wearing what looked like work gear, scruffy but not unusual. He seemed like he'd had a rough day, so my colleague gave him the benefit of the doubt and poured him one last takeaway pint for the road. About an hour later, he was still at the bar, staring blankly into space, eyes glazed over. A textbook blackout case, not falling over drunk, not passed out, but utterly vacant. Since we were about to close, I signaled the bouncer to escort him out. At first, he looked confused, but then he complied without any trouble. No drama. We locked up, cleaned quickly, and left about 45 minutes later. I usually walked home since it wasn't far and the area was completely deserted at that hour. But this time, as I stepped outside, I noticed our blackout guy sitting on a wall across the street staring into nothingness. I watched him with mild concern, wondering how he'd get home, when suddenly he looked up and recognized me. Immediately he stood and started crossing the street toward me. He didn't say anything, just walked. But he kept pace behind me on the pavement, following me steadily. My heart started pounding. I tried to stay calm, but I could hear his footsteps growing louder behind me. I pulled out my phone and pretended to call my boyfriend. At the time I was single, but I put on my best casual tone. "Hey, I'm about to catch the bus home. Want to meet me? Oh, you're already nearby? Cool, see you soon." I kept walking, heading for the nearest bus stop. When I got there, I sat down on the bench, still pretending to be on the phone. The blackout guy lingered nearby, not doing anything obvious, but making it very clear he was waiting for something. That something was me. It was terrifying. Thankfully, my fake phone call seemed to do the trick. After a while, he started shuffling away down the road. Only problem? He was heading in the same direction I needed to go. Not a huge deal, I thought. I'd just take the first bus that arrived, no matter where it was going. I could figure the rest out later as long as I got away from him. 15 minutes later, the bus pulled up. I got on, sat down, exhaled. Safe. Or so I thought. The next stop came. One passenger climbed aboard, dropping a handful of coins into the tray. I looked up. Guess who? It was him. He walked right past me without a glance and sat directly behind me. At that moment, I ran out of ideas. I knew he would get off at my stop and follow me home. And since I lived alone, the thought of being stalked to my door was unbearable. Check the time. That's when I got my best idea yet. Right after my stop, there was a Tesco with a 24-hour entrance. The store had just opened, meaning there would be staff inside. Security, cashiers, maybe even a manager. If I could get inside and explain, they might let me hide somewhere safe. So I did exactly that. I stepped off the bus, and sure enough, he followed. I walked straight into Tesco, heart pounding. As soon as I spotted the security guard, I hurried over and quickly explained the situation. He didn't even hesitate. He led me to a back office where they usually held shoplifters and called the police. Meanwhile, my blackout stalker loitered outside, waiting. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. He was an easy pickup. I don't know if they charged him with anything or just let him sleep it off in a holding cell, but honestly, I didn't care. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. I don't know if he figured out my fake phone call or if he just happened to see me get on that bus, but realizing he had followed me that far was one of the worst moments of my life. I just feel terrible for the girls who have no one to run to in situations like that. So this happened over 2 years ago, back in 2016. I had just started a new job at a motel. The pay was low, but I needed an office job as a requirement for a training program. A friend of mine, Daniel, helped me get the job. During my first few days, I was trained by the owner in the mornings, and for 2 nights, Daniel trained me on the night shift. Our shift was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Nothing too exciting, just checking in guests and doing paperwork. My boss, the owner, had gone on vacation with his wife for a week, which meant I had to handle my first solo night shift. There was a security monitor displaying camera feeds around the motel, and the office had large glass windows. The doors were glass as well, with no open window service at night like most motels. It was still pretty early, around 1 a.m. I was going through paperwork when a man walked in and asked if we had any available rooms. Usually, if someone seemed suspicious, my boss instructed me to lie and say we were full, but he looked normal enough. and we had recently had a meeting about customer satisfaction, where my boss encouraged us to be more polite to guests. Without hesitation, I told him, "Yes, of course. Just one room?" He responded with a simple, "Yes," so I began the check-in process on the computer. As I was entering his information, he suddenly started swatting at the air and making spitting noises as if he were surrounded by flies. I tried to ignore it. Whatever he was doing wasn't my business. I just focused on getting him into his room as quickly as possible. I handed him his key and he headed off. At this point, I should mention that I was very shy and dealing with a lot in my personal life. So, I hope you all can understand my reaction to what happened next. The man came back from his room and slammed his hands against the glass door, making me jump in fear. I looked up and saw him staring straight at me. He opened the door, stuck his head inside, and said, "I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me in?" My only defense mechanism was to try and help, so I replied, "Oh, maybe there's an issue with your key. Let me get you another one." His expression was unreadable, but I felt a deep sense of unease. I handed him a new key, and he returned to his room. I tried texting Daniel since he had trained me, even though it was the middle of the night and he was likely asleep. I needed guidance, but there was no response. Then, I noticed the man slowly making his way down the stairs again. I went into full panic mode. I ran to the back office, locked the door, and grabbed my pocket knife, an important thing to have for those of us working night shifts. From inside the office, I could hear him calling out, "Hello? Hello? Why won't you let me in? Don't you like me?" I was completely frozen in fear, but instead of calling the police like I should have, I made a stupid decision. I tried to handle the situation myself. I responded, "I'm just on a call, I'll be right out." I kept dialing Daniel over and over, but he never picked up. Taking a deep breath, I finally stepped out of the office. The man was no longer by the EO, or he was in the bathroom. Then I started hearing him talk to himself. "Kill her, kill her, kill her." My stomach dropped. I should have called the police right then and there. But instead, still being an absolute idiot, I forced a smile and said, "Oh, your key must have been faulty. I'm sorry about that. Let me walk you to your room." Luckily, he agreed. I was wearing a long-sleeved sweater, so I discreetly held my pocket knife in my hand as I led him back. I made sure to walk ahead of him, glancing back carefully to ensure he wasn't making any sudden movements. As we approached the rooms, he suddenly stopped at the wrong door. I paused a few doors down, standing in front of his actual room. Smiling nervously, I said, "Oh, that's not your room. This one is yours," pointing to the clearly labeled number. The entire time, he had been trying to get into someone else's. And as soon as he started fumbling with the wrong door, I sprinted back to the office and locked myself inside. The next guest to check in happened to be an off-duty cop from a few towns over. I felt bad for the guy about what had just happened, but he seemed more than willing to keep an eye on things for the rest of the night. The following night, the same man came back, but I had locked the doors and simply told him we were fully booked. When my boss returned from his vacation, I explained everything that had happened. Unfortunately, he didn't take it very seriously. I continued working the night shift there for another year, during which I had more strange encounters. It's crazy to think about, but I never saw that man again. If you ever feel unsafe, always call the police. Don't be like me.